This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do?
Well, I have to say I'm very sad that our conference is drawing to a close. There are only two things that temper my sadness. One is the fact that the conversations that have begun here, I hope will continue well beyond here and for a long time and in many different forums and in many different contexts. So that's one thing that makes it a little easier to bring this to a close. And the other is that I get to introduce our final speaker, David Bradley. David Bradley is the author of two novels, South Street and the Chaneysville Incident. The latter was awarded the 1982 PEN/Faulkner Award and an Academy Award from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, and is widely regarded as one of the great American novels of the 20th century. His nonfiction has appeared in Esquire, Redbook, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The New Yorker, and most recently he's shared some provocative and groundbreaking insights into Paul Laurence Dunbar in the essays he contributed to the Modern Library edition of Dunbar's writing that came out this year. The recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEA, he has taught at Temple University, MIT, the University of Texas, and currently the University of Oregon. His current works in progress include a creative nonfiction book, The Bondage Hypothesis, Meditations on Race, History, and America, a novel in stories, Ray's Town, and an essay collection, Lunch Bucket Pieces, new and selected creative nonfiction. I think it's highly appropriate that the final paper at this conference devoted to a great American writer be given by a great American writer. Please join me in welcoming David Bradley.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for staying even though the corks have been popping and, you know, the corn pone's hot. It's kind of hard. Well, anyway, I'm always intimidated when I stand before a gathering of scholars because I recall the evaluation written by one of my graduate tutors. As a scholar, Bradley is adequate as opposed to brilliant. This was in England, and it was typical British understatement because the truth it was and is, I am no scholar at all. What I am is a writer. I began as a writer of fiction, and part of me still delights to Mark Twain's line, I don't believe these details are right, but I don't care a rap. They will do just as well as the facts. Although in my later career I've become a writer of nonfiction, is what is called creative nonfiction. I take my methodology from the playwright Wilson Meisner, who said, if you steal from one author, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's research. I try to stop short of actual larceny and attempt to acknowledge sources and always admit that in creating nonfiction text, I am dependent, sometimes heavily dependent, on scholars and their scholarship. Certainly this was true when I began writing some of the introductory materials for what has since been published as The Sport of the Gods and Other Essential Writings of Paul Laurence Dunbar, henceforth TSOTG. Which publication is one reason the good folks who organized this conference have allowed me to attend. The other reason is that my collaborator on that project was Professor Shelley Fishkin. It is not the first time that she has risked her reputation and her sanity by collaborating with me, and I want to take this opportunity to thank her, not only for involving me professionally with Dunbar, but for the many times she has, figuratively and literally, dragged me along to a party to which only she has actually been invited. I also want to take this opportunity to assure her peers that I'm the one responsible for any and all weirdness in TSOTG. Lest anybody get confused, she's the sane one with the PhD in American Studies from Yale, and I'm the gonzo with the MA in United States Studies from a British institute that is now defunct. In our various collaborations, she has been the voice of scholarly responsibility. I think of her as Saint Jerome, the Catholic priest who learned Hebrew to correct the Catholic Latin Bible. I have been the voice of David Farragut, the Civil War naval commander who almost said, "Full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes." What Farragut actually said was, "Damn the torpedoes, Captain Drayton, go ahead, jouer, full speed," which correction is the kind of scholarly nicety that Professor Fishkin has insisted upon. And so it was as we were finishing up the writing of the introductions. Actually, she had finished the introductions that she was writing, and I was still mucking about, missing deadlines, and making the publisher very nervous. But she insisted that I stop and look at a physical copy of Majors and Minors, an exercise in scholarly due diligence I considered unnecessary. Now, I'm sure everybody knows what I'm about to say, but they tell me they're going to publish these papers, and there's a possibility it'll fall in the hands of one of my students who would just love to catch me failing to establish proper foundation, so please forgive this summary. Dunbar's first volume was Oak and Ivy, which was not so much published as printed at the author's expense with a loan from a white gentleman in Dayton, Ohio. Oak and Ivy gained Dunbar a national reputation among the Negro intelligentsia, including Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. It also gained the support of a number of white Ohioans, notably H.A. Tobey of Toledo. Tobey formed a consortium of white Toledo clubmen, which funded the printing of Dunbar's second volume, Majors and Minors. It was Tobey who sent a copy of Majors and Minors to Robert Ingersoll, which eventually resulted in Dunbar's clerkship at the Library of Congress. And it was Tobey who urged Dunbar to hand-deliver a copy of Majors and Minors to actor-playwright James A. Hearn, who not only liked it, but passed the copy on to William Dean Howells. Howells, as we all know, lauded Dunbar in his literary column in Harper's Weekly, introducing the poet to the white literary elite. And Howells, by agreeing to write an introduction, encouraged Dodd Mead to publish Dunbar's third volume, Lyrics of Lowly Life. That summary is artistically deceiving, however. Although Dunbar wrote new poems for each volume, he compiled Majors and Minors and Lyrics of Lowly Life using some poems from the previous volume. In other words, both Majors and Minors and Lyrics of Lowly Life could have been subtitled New and Selected Poems. This causes no great problem in terms of authorship, because although the process was surely influenced by commercial concerns, audience reaction, and eventually Howells' opinions, it seems Dunbar made the decisions himself. It does cause a problem in terms of history, because the first two volumes were produced cheaply, warehoused informally, and usually became old books before they could become rare books and properly archived, which means poems that didn't make the cut for the next volume were hard to find. Worse, when Dunbar went from paying printers to being paid by publishers, the poems he had eliminated entered a legal limbo with respect to reprint rights. When Dodd Mead decided to publish a posthumous complete poems, it based that text only on volumes it had published to which it had the rights, which meant the complete poems should have been titled the almost complete poems. Fortunately, this problem was largely solved by Professor Braxton's 1993 collected poetry, which dealt with the complexities by first reproducing the 1913 text, the complete poems, and then including over 24 added poems, some being those which failed to make the cut. I am much obliged to Professor Braxton for those added poems, for they proved crucial in helping me to a writer's understanding of Dunbar. One of those added poems, for example, is entitled To Alice Dunbar, and provides a valuable counterpoint to some of the simplistic and simple-minded assertions about that relationship that have been made in recent years. More relevant to Sport of the Gods and the Other Essential Writings, TSOTG, was a poem called Lager Bier, written in raucous German dialect that would have been heard in the streets of Dayton at the time. Dunbar's address to the welcome address to the Western Association of Writers was also included. In fact, Professor Braxton's work seemed so useful that I saw Professor In fact, Professor Braxton's work seemed so useful that I saw Professor Fishkin's suggestion that I look at a physical copy of Majors and Minors as annoyingly pro forma, especially as I was getting these insistent emails from the editor about, when are you going to be finished? When are you going to be finished? But there's no point in working with a scholar if you're going to ignore advice, so I did look at Majors and Minors and saw something very strange. Look, Ma, no minors. I am addressing the notion advanced by many critics that entitling his second volume, Majors and Minors, Dunbar was labeling poems he wrote in so-called standard English, although it was actually Romantic English, or as I call it, High English, major, and poems he wrote in Negro dialect, minor. Some critics have extended this notion to argue that the labeling reflected a cultural brainwashing, a deep internal conflict about race, at best a bit of Du Boisian double consciousness, at worst a subconscious self-loathing. Professor Braxton summarized this in her introduction to the 1993 collected poetry, and I apologize to her for some of the additions here, but it's a good summary, so I'll steal it. Oh, sorry, research. Quote, "The central debate concerning Dunbar's poetry had begun to emerge when his second collection, Majors and Minors, was reviewed by William Dean Howells in the June 27, 1896 issue of Harper's Weekly. Howells' review drew wide attention to Dunbar, but it also limited the appreciation of the work of the 24-year-old poet by declaring that the minors were his real strength and that there was nothing especially notable in Dunbar's standard English verse except for the Negro face of the author. With these words, Howells dismissed Dunbar's traditional verse and set the direction for future Dunbar criticism, a line, in the words of Benjamin Brawley, slavishly adhered to by reviewers." Those are all Professor Braxton's words, except when she's quoting somebody else. This sounds like it's one of the dialect problems in those letters we were anyway. Professor Braxton goes on to summarize the argument of Charles T. Davis, who, and this is my evaluation, not hers, seems extreme. Davis suggests that Dunbar's own use of the term minors to describe his dialect verse suggests, quote, problems about, this is Braxton quoting Davis, okay? Quote, problems about the poet's attitude about the use of dialect. One of Dunbar's failings, Davis suggests, is that he never fully understood that he had to make a decision. Dunbar, Davis contends, lacked self-assurance where his dialect poems were concerned. Because of his cultural ambivalence, Dunbar, quote, could not bring himself to perform the act of will. This confusion distinguishes Dunbar from the generation of Negro artists who followed him, who were bold in their claims about the artistic value of racialized cultural materials, where Dunbar remained apologetic. Now, I have to admit a bias here. I'm a writer, and writers just hate it when critics get all psychological, especially if they start insinuating some poor dead artist had some problem that adversely affected his or her work. I mean, it's true in some cases, but it's also true that some critics had problems that adversely affected their work. And I do mean critics quick as well as dead. What's more, as scholarship is cumulative, the critic's problem tends to become intellectually infectious. And listening to the description of how Dunbar was received initially in China, I was taken by, my God, even if you dug all the way through the earth, you'd still come up with some of this stuff. As Dunbar himself lamented, one critic says a thing and the rest hasten to say the same things, in many cases using the identical words. And I must admit a second bias, which I hope this company will understand. Having worked on Dunbar, as they say, for a couple of years, I had lost my intellectual objectivity about him. I had come to empathize with Dunbar as a fellow writer caught up in the complex conflicts between art and ambition and commerce. What writer has not longed, as Dunbar did, to make his living by his pen, even as he hated the hustle of the literary marketplace? What writer, born in the hinterlands, has not hungered for and feared the bustle of the cities where literary names are made? What writer, fortunate enough to gain public notice, has not felt a certain vertigo at the loss of the very isolation in which he had written successfully? What writer, receiving serious critical attention, has not felt ambivalence, if not dismay, if not outright rage at seeing his work masticated, half-digested, and then regurgitated for public consumption like so much bovine cud? What writer has not experienced the manias and depressions forced upon him by this bipolar business? I mean, one day you're in an elevator, you're an elevator operator who had to repeat his last year of high school and trying to borrow money for college. The next you're reading at a college and being praised by some guy with 2 BAs, an MA, and a PhD from Harvard. One month you're in the city, glad to get a part-time job cleaning toilets. The next month you're on a stage of the largest auditorium west of the Appalachians, opening for Frederick Douglass. And the next month, you're back in the boonies, broke, begging to be allowed to use your college money to pay the mortgage, and marveling that God made you a poet and bids you sing in a town whose greatest contribution, cultural contribution, was the cash register. And please note, none of those points of empathy were specific to race. Except for a few details, I could have been talking about Herman Melville or Mark Twain. And of course, I had come to sympathize with Dunbar because of the great, cruel tragedy of his tuberculosis. To be lifted up so high, only to be slammed down so hard by something so minuscule as a microbe, to find that modern science could do nothing to save you, nothing even to palliate your suffering, could only let you look, quote, upon the little red hair-like devils who are eating up your lungs, and suggest you drink whiskey for medicinal purposes. And I'd come to admire the man who could write about that last experience. So many of us are cowards when we look into the cold, white eyes of death, and I suppose I am no better or braver than the rest of humanity. But indeed he was. Surely he felt more than physical fear at the certainty of his early death. He felt the fear of which John Keats wrote, that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. I admired that, even with death a certainty and heaven but a hope, he kept keeping on. To see a life like that reduced to some alleged ambivalence about race because of a label he had used in a self-published book long before he could possibly have seen that that decision, not even an artistic decision, was having such great implications, well, it just flat pissed me off. Emotion aside, I also thought the critical opinion was incorrect. It seemed to me a man does not see his own epitaph as a minor work, or write it in what he dismisses as a broken tongue. As a writer, I knew how to respond to that kind of criticism, but I was working on TSOTG, and I was not free to respond entirely as a writer, which is to say, by dismissing the criticism, or ignoring it, or by calling the critics nasty names. Not only was I collaborating with a responsible scholar who might be tarred and feathered by my writerly intemperance, the project itself was essentially scholarly, and temperate outbursts were inappropriate to the form. Accordingly, I came up with a complex rationalization for Dunbar's application of the terms major and minor. In other words, a theory. Part of the theory depended from the connotations that those terms have in music. Another part depended from a close reading of that jingle in a broken tongue phrase from the poet. The important term, I argued, was not the broken tongue, but the jingle, technically a simple verse crafted to be easily remembered. Dunbar wrote many jingles, some in Negro dialect, some in non-Negro dialect, some not in dialect at all. What Dunbar was lamenting in the poet was that jingles were what his editors craved in preference to his songs, quote, of life serenely sweet, with now and then a deeper note, some of which were in Negro dialect, some in non-Negro dialect, and some not in dialect at all. I dismissed the broken tongue part because, well, it's a poem, and the words appeared at the end of the line, and sometimes you're trying to make a statement, and sometimes you're just trying to bust a rhyme. As I knew I was going against strong critical current, I supported the theory with evidence tailored to scholarly constituencies. I got Samuel Coleridge Taylor in there to try to make the Pan-Africanist happy. I got Anna Julia Cooper in there to try to make the feminists happy. I got Antonin Dvorak in there to try to make the internationalists happy. I even got Dunbar's mother in there to try to make the Freudians happy. When I was finished, it was a pretty good theory, if I did say so myself, which made me all the more resistant to Professor Fishkin's insistence that I look at some old book. I mean, why mess up a theory with random data? Fortunately, St. Jerome spirited a copy from some rare book collection, I believe at the Stanford Library, and passed it on to me. And I saw immediately that the theory was unnecessary because Dunbar did not use the term minors to refer to his Negro dialect verse. The volume was originally printed has two sections. The first titled Majors and Minors, the second titled Humor and Dialect. Each section has its own decorative half-title page. With one exception, all the poems included in the Majors and Minors section are written in High English, not dialect. All the Negro dialect poems are in the section headed Humor and Dialect. It is therefore clear that the overall volume title, Majors and Minors, cannot be said to indicate Dunbar considered Negro dialect poems necessarily to be minor. Look, Ma, no minors. Now, to be fair to all those critics to whom Professor Braxton refers, there is evidence that Dunbar was unhappy about the emphasis placed on his dialect poems. While I still like my close reading of the poet, I was definitely pushing a point. Dunbar surely was miffed about the broken tongue business, and embarrassed by reviewers that called him Prince of the coon songwriters, and probably did complain to James Weldon Johnson that he had trouble selling anything but dialect poems. Admittedly, that evidence comes from a memoir written decades after the fact, but as Oprah Winfrey can tell you, memoirs are always perfectly reliable historical documents. But the basis for the psychological argument that Dunbar felt some kind of ambivalence or conflict about dialect, about people who spoke in dialect, and about his own dark, as opposed to mulatto self, is based on the distinction between majors and minors, a distinction that Dunbar himself never made. I tell this story to illustrate that whatever problems writers may have that might adversely affect their work, and whatever problems critics may have that might adversely affect their work, American society surely has a problem that has without doubt adversely affected everybody's work. You know the problem I mean, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line. The question as to how far differences of race will hereafter be made the basis of denying to over half the world the right of sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. In fact, it has been the problem of every American century. It was a problem in the 18th century when, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, whites needed a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. It became a literary problem when Jefferson provided that obstacle by claiming blacks were inferior in body and mind, asserting in part, "Never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches of poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry." It was a problem in the 19th century when white racists needed powerful excuses to deny these people their citizenship and civil rights. It became a literary problem when they trotted out Jefferson's pathetic prevarications to do that dirty job, and more honest thinkers, black and white, sought to counter the argument using Negro literature. It became a problem for Dunbar when some of those honest thinkers, although they admired and appreciated his art, saw in it, and in Dunbar's black as opposed to mulatto genes, their best evidence that even if what Jefferson said was once true, it was true no longer. Meanwhile, Dunbar wanted only to sing his songs and make his living and try to make his living with his pen. In the 20th century, critics would do worse. As one of their most perceptive, Darwin Turner, repeatedly complained, emphasis upon Dunbar as a symbol has tended to obscure the actual image of the man and his work. They would ascribe to him the mental torture of double consciousness described by his friend Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. They would not, by and large, allow him the understanding and ambition which Du Bois also described. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, or as a writer might add, to be both a Negro, an American, and a writer. They made every dialect poem into a Negro dialect poem. And in a critical atmosphere where signifiers seem to make more sense, be more important than words and tropes, critics failed to notice that We Wear the Mask had no racial signifiers. And that's, yeah. As I began to write the introductions for TSOTG, I tried to find a way to escape all that mess, a way to look past what we had been told about Dunbar and try to see the image Darwin Turner said we had not seen. I'm going to mention just a few of these, and if it sounds like I'm trying to sell a book, I am. My first idea, and this was one of the weird aspects of other essential writings, was to look at Dunbar as a product of Trans-Appalachia, the post-frontier entity that was achieving wealth and influence and cultural importance at the end of the 19th century. Its symbol was the World's Columbian Exposition, where Dunbar appeared at the same venue, albeit not at the same time, as another young man named Frederick Jackson Turner, who presented a weird hypothesis about the importance of the frontier, which would become the dominant paradigm of American historiography for the next 7 decades or so. But even before the exposition, Dunbar had strong Western identity. His debut to the world of letters took place at a conference of the Western Association of Writers, where he read a poem extolling the power of the West. Some of his strongest dialect poem was actually written in Trans-Appalachian dialect. 3 of his 4 novels were set in Trans-Appalachia, one in Colorado. and that novel he anticipated tropes that would show up in an allegedly prototypical Western novel, Owen Wister's The Virginian. And of course, he bought a horse. Another idea was to explore Dunbar's connections with other writers on the basis of purely artistic concerns. As William Dean Howells and more recently and exhortatively Professor Braxton has noted, there is a connection with Robert Burns, but there is also an artistic connection with other unlikely seeming poets, such as Oliver Goldsmith, William Blake, James Whitcomb Riley, and Robert Louis Stevenson. I had intended to make much of that, but Professor Terry's paper made me realize I had missed a whole set of connections between Dunbar and poets inspired by the Civil War, which would include Melville, Whittier, and Whitman. And what I would have emphasized in Stevenson is what perhaps the weirdest aspect of this whole business, that the critics seem to have treated Dunbar's tuberculosis as if it were no worse than a bad cold. Rather than reiterate what I would have said, I will refer to another paper delivered yesterday by Professor Walagora Davis, her jazzy CSI meets new criticism reading of the lynching of June Benson. As you probably suspect, I found that fusion very exciting. But it also inspired a thought that in this text, Dunbar, who was being killed by a microbe which physicians could see under a microscope but could not banish from his body, wrote about a physician who saw truth under a microscope too late to save a life. In her introductory paper, Professor Braxton asked us here to try to set aside. I wanted to use the phrases, but she wouldn't tell me exactly what she said, because I think she understands how writers do research, having been one herself. For as we scholars, writers, all of us, all Americans, have failed to solve the problem of the 20th century in the 20th century, we must now deal with the problem in a metastasized form. The good news is we should be able to do it. For we now know scientifically that, as Ralph Ellison said, there is no gene for culture. We know, as Du Bois could only hope, that races, which are clearly defined by the eye of the historian and the sociologist, are only so defined. So then, the question for the 21st century: how far differences of race will continue to shape and inevitably limit our thinking about all the artifacts of human civilization, including culture, particularly American culture, including art, particularly American art, including literature, particularly American literature, including specifically the writing of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.